If I had opened that envelope just 1 minute later, perhaps I would never have seen my husband the same way again. Years later, that was the sentence Priscilla could never erase from her memory. Because hidden inside a single white envelope was not a secret. It was the weight of thousands of hearts. And before the sun had disappeared behind the rain that evening, one simple question would leave even Elvis Presley speechless. The rain had been falling over Graceland since before sunrise. It wasn't loud, it wasn't violent. It was the kind of rain that made old houses breathe, the kind that slowed time, the kind that wrapped every window in silver and made forgotten memories quietly rise to the surface. Inside the mansion, everything felt unusually still. The crystal chandelier reflected pale morning light across polished wooden floors. The grandfather clock ticked with almost painful precision. Every second echoed through the empty halls. Tick, tick, tick. Priscilla Presley stood alone in the living room. Only a few hours earlier, Elvis had kissed her forehead before leaving for another recording session. He had smiled the same familiar smile. "Don't wait up if I'm late." Then he disappeared into the gray morning behind the wheel of his Cadillac. Now the house felt enormous, too enormous. Millions of people dreamed of stepping inside Graceland. Yet at this very moment, its silence felt heavier than its fame. Priscilla slowly gathered several music sheets scattered across the piano. The final page still held unfinished lyrics in Elvis's handwriting, a melody without an ending. She smiled softly. "He'll finish it tonight," she whispered. She didn't know that before sunset, another unfinished story would find its way into their home. A sharp knock interrupted the silence. Not once, twice. Then the sound of the doorbell followed. Priscilla frowned. Visitors almost never came this early. She crossed the hallway, opened the massive front door. A mail carrier stood beneath a soaked cap, rain dripping from every corner of his jacket. "Morning, Mrs. Presley." His voice sounded unusually careful. "I have something that requires special delivery." He reached into his leather bag, then pulled out a thick ivory envelope. The moment Priscilla accepted it, she felt its weight. It was far heavier than any ordinary letter, almost as if it carried more than paper. "There isn't any return address," the mail carrier explained. "Only strict instructions." "What instructions?" He pointed toward the elegant handwriting across the front. Priscilla looked down. 3 words, nothing else. For Elvis Presley. No sender, no city, no stamp from any company. Only those 3 words. She thanked the mail carrier, closed the door. The sound of rain immediately swallowed the outside world again. She walked into the living room and carefully placed the envelope on the coffee table. Then she stepped away. 1 step, 2, 3. She stopped. Something didn't feel right. It wasn't curiosity. It wasn't fear. It was something far stranger. As if the envelope itself had carried someone's heartbeat all the way to Graceland. She tried to ignore it. Instead, she walked into the kitchen. She filled the kettle, turned on the stove, watched tiny bubbles slowly appear beneath the water. Steam began to rise. Normally, mornings like this brought peace. Today, peace refused to stay. Her eyes drifted back toward the living room, toward the envelope. Still waiting, still untouched, almost patient. She laughed quietly at herself. "You're imagining things." But the uneasy feeling refused to disappear.
She carried her tea into the living room, sat beside the fireplace. The flames danced softly. Outside, thunder rolled somewhere far away. She lifted the cup. Before it reached her lips, her eyes found the envelope again. She set the tea back down untouched.
The silence inside Graceland had suddenly become unbearable. "I'm sorry, Elvis," she whispered. "If this is important, you'll understand." She carefully slid one finger beneath the seal. The paper opened with a soft whisper. She expected one letter, perhaps two. Instead, the entire envelope burst open. Dozens of handwritten letters spilled across the polished table like leaves caught in an autumn wind. White envelopes, blue envelopes, pink stationery, yellowed pages folded countless times. Some were tied together with faded ribbons. Others carried dried flowers pressed between delicate sheets of paper. One after another, they covered the table. Priscilla simply stared. Her heartbeat quickened. There had to be more than 40 letters. Every single one addressed to Elvis. Every single one written by hand. Every single one carrying someone's heart. She slowly reached for the first. The handwriting was elegant, gentle. The ink had faded with time. She unfolded the paper.
"Dear Elvis, we have never met. You have never spoken my name. But every lonely night, your voice reminds me that hope still exists. If heaven ever grants me one miracle, let it be hearing you laugh from only a few feet away." Priscilla lowered the letter. She didn't know the woman who wrote it, yet somehow she could almost hear her voice. She placed it aside, opened another. This handwriting looked younger, less certain. Several words had been crossed out and rewritten. "Mr. Presley, everyone tells me your wife is the luckiest woman alive. I suppose they're right. Sometimes I close my eyes and wonder what it must feel like when you look at someone with love instead of through a television screen. If only for one day, I would trade my entire life for hers." Priscilla's fingers tightened around the page. Her wedding ring suddenly felt heavier than ever before. Another letter, another stranger, another heart, another dream. One came from a widow. Another from a young nurse working endless night shifts. Another from a teenage girl recovering alone in a hospital room. Another from a soldier stationed thousands of miles from home. Every single story ended the same way. Elvis had never met them, yet somehow he had become part of their lives. Some thanked him for giving them strength. Some thanked him for saving them from loneliness. Some confessed feelings they knew would never be returned. There was no jealousy in those pages, only hope, only admiration, only love. And somehow, that made them hurt even more. Priscilla leaned back in silence. For the first time, she understood something that fame had hidden for years. The world did not simply admire Elvis Presley. Millions believed they knew him. Millions believed a tiny piece of his heart belonged to them. She closed her eyes. She remembered every sleepless night, every exhausted tour, every moment Elvis returned home too tired to speak. The world saw the spotlight. She saw the man standing behind it. Yet these women, they loved the dream. A single tear rolled down her cheek, then another. One drop landed upon the final unopened letter. She quickly wiped it away before the ink could blur. As she gathered the remaining envelopes, something slid from the bottom. Not another letter,
a worn black-and-white photograph. Young Elvis, barely older than a boy, standing shoulder to shoulder with smiling fans. His grin was effortless, untouched by fame, untouched by pressure, untouched by the weight the world would eventually place upon him. Priscilla turned the photograph over. On the back, someone had written a single sentence. The handwriting trembled so badly that every letter looked as though it had been written through tears. Priscilla felt her breathing slow. Her hands began to shake. Without knowing why, she suddenly became afraid to read the words, because deep inside her heart, she already knew whatever was written on the other side of that photograph. Nothing inside Graceland would ever feel quite the same again. Priscilla closed her eyes. For several long seconds, she couldn't bring herself to turn the photograph over. The rain outside grew heavier, striking the windows of Graceland with a slow, relentless rhythm. Every heartbeat seemed to echo through the silent room. Finally, she gathered enough courage. Her trembling fingers flipped the photograph. Only one sentence was written across the back. The ink had faded, but every word remained painfully clear. We could never make you ours, but our hearts never learned how to let you go. Priscilla stopped breathing. The room blurred before her eyes. A tear slipped silently down her cheek and landed directly on the final word. She gently wiped it away before the ink could disappear forever. She read the sentence again and again. Each time, it hurt a little more. Not because she doubted Elvis. She never had. It hurt because, for the very first time, she truly understood the impossible burden her husband carried every single day. Millions of strangers loved him. Millions prayed for him. Millions dreamed about him. Yet every evening, only one woman waited for him to come home. She lowered the photograph onto her lap. Around her, the letters seemed almost alive. Each envelope represented a person, a dream, a lonely heart, a silent prayer that would never be answered. She carefully picked up another letter. The paper was fragile. The handwriting belonged to an elderly woman. Dear Elvis, I am writing this knowing you will probably never read these words. My husband passed away 3 winters ago. Since then, your records have been the only voices inside this quiet house. When you sing, I do not feel alone anymore. Thank you for helping me survive the nights. Priscilla slowly folded the letter. She pressed it gently against her chest. The tears came without warning, not because the woman loved Elvis, because she needed him. Another letter. This one smelled faintly of old perfume.
The paper carried tiny pressed lavender flowers between its pages.
Elvis, I know you belong to someone else. I know you owe me nothing. But if love can exist without ever being returned, then perhaps mine will simply remain a secret carried by the wind.
Priscilla covered her mouth. Every letter seemed to reveal another life, another story, another reason why one man had unknowingly become the light inside someone's darkness. She looked toward the grand piano. Elvis had once told her something after returning from a concert. He had looked exhausted. Thousands of fans had surrounded his limousine. Women had screamed his name until their voices disappeared. Reporters chased him. Flashbulbs exploded everywhere. When they finally reached home, he had collapsed onto the sofa, then quietly said, "Sometimes I wish they could meet the man after the applause ends." At the time, Priscilla hadn't fully understood. Now she did.
The world fell in love with the legend. She had fallen in love with the tired man who sometimes couldn't sleep. The man who laughed too loudly at old movies. The man who burned pancakes almost every Sunday morning. The man who worried whether he was disappointing people. The man who hated seeing anyone cry. The legend belonged to the world. The man belonged here, at home. Another envelope caught her attention. Unlike the others, it had never been sealed. Inside was only a single page. No greeting, no signature, only one question. When the crowds disappear, who reminds you that you are still just a man? Priscilla stared at the page. Her heart tightened. She whispered the answer before realizing she had spoken aloud. I do. The room fell silent again. Outside, the rain finally began to soften. Sunlight briefly pushed through the clouds. A single golden beam crossed the floor and landed directly on the photograph. Young Elvis smiled forever from another time, before the fame, before the pressure, before millions of people believed they knew him. Priscilla picked up the photograph once more. She traced his younger face with her fingertip. You'd been carrying all of this alone, her voice broke. Haven't you? A sudden sound interrupted the silence. An engine, far beyond the front gate. She looked toward the window. Her heart skipped. A familiar black Cadillac slowly entered the driveway. Elvis was home, much earlier than expected. The tires rolled carefully across the wet stones. The engine stopped. Silence returned. Then came the sound she knew better than any other. The car door opening. Footsteps. Steady, unhurried, drawing closer with every second. Priscilla quickly tried gathering the letters. They were too many. Some slipped from her hands, others scattered across the polished floor. The photograph slid beneath the edge of the coffee table. She reached for it. Too late. The front door opened. Cool air drifted inside. Elvis stepped into the hallway, shaking raindrops from his dark coat. He smiled the moment he saw her. Hey, sweetheart. Then he noticed the room. Letters everywhere, photographs, open envelopes, and tears running silently down Priscilla's face. His smile disappeared. He didn't ask what happened. He simply stood there, looking at the letters, looking at his wife. The entire house seemed to stop breathing. For one long moment, neither of them spoke. Only the grandfather clock continued its steady rhythm. Tick, tick, tick. Elvis slowly walked into the living room. His eyes fell upon the old black-and-white photograph lying beside Priscilla. Recognition flashed across his face. He remembered it instantly. He remembered the day it had been taken. He remembered every smiling face beside him. He remembered promising himself that no matter how famous he became, he would never forget the people who believed in him before the world did. He bent down, carefully picked up the photograph. His thumb brushed across its worn edges. Then his eyes found the sentence written on the back. For the first time that day. His own eyes became glassy. Priscilla looked at him through her tears. Her voice barely rose above a whisper. Elvis. He looked up. She struggled to finish the sentence. I've spent years wondering whether the world would one day take you away from me. Another tear escaped. I never realized, she paused, that every single day You came home carrying the weight of all their love on your shoulders." Elvis said nothing. He slowly looked around the room, at every letter, every envelope, every life that had somehow reached his doorstep. Then he carefully gathered them into his arms, not carelessly, not hurriedly, as though each one carried a human heart instead of paper. Priscilla watched in silence. She believed she knew what he was about to do. She thought he would throw them into the fireplace, destroy them, erase them forever. Instead, Elvis held them against his chest, closed his eyes, and took one slow, trembling breath. When he finally opened them again, he looked directly at Priscilla. There was something in his expression she had never seen before. Not guilt, not shame, not fear. Only overwhelming gratitude, mixed with a sadness too deep for words. He stepped toward her, stopped only a few feet away, opened his mouth to speak. The first words that left his lips would change everything she believed about love. The room was so quiet that even the rain seemed to stop outside Graceland. Elvis stood only a few feet away from Priscilla. The bundle of old letters rested gently in his hands. He looked at them for a long moment, then back into his wife's tear-filled eyes. Neither of them rushed to speak. Some silences carry more truth than words ever could. Priscilla tried to smile. She couldn't. Her voice trembled instead. "So many women loved you." She lowered her eyes. "So many dreamed about sharing a life with you." Another tear escaped before she could stop it. She finally asked the question that had been growing inside her heart all afternoon. "Am I enough for you, Elvis?" The words echoed through the room, then disappeared into silence. Elvis didn't answer immediately. Instead, he slowly walked toward the fireplace. The flames danced softly against the polished stone. The letters remained safely in his hands. Priscilla watched him. Part of her expected him to throw every single letter into the fire, to erase them forever, to prove that none of them mattered. His hand moved toward the flames. Then it stopped. He smiled sadly. "No," he whispered. "They don't deserve that." Priscilla looked at him in surprise. Elvis carefully carried the letters back to the coffee table. One by one, he placed every envelope into the large ivory package exactly as he had found them. Not because he wanted to hide them, because each letter represented a real person, a real life, a real heart. When the final envelope disappeared inside, he gently closed the package. His fingers rested on it for several seconds. Then he turned toward Priscilla. He walked slowly until they stood face to face. Without saying a word, he reached for her hands. They were cold. He wrapped them inside his own. Then, almost in a whisper, he finally answered her question. "They love Elvis Presley." He paused. His eyes never left hers. They love the man they see beneath bright lights. They love the voice that fills arenas. They love the photographs, the records, the dream. His voice grew softer. "But you," he smiled through tears, "you met me after the concerts. You saw me when my voice was gone. You stayed when the crowds disappeared. You watched me doubt myself. You listened when I had nothing worth singing. You loved me on days when I wasn't the king." He gently squeezed her hands. "You didn't fall in love with Elvis Presley. You fell in love with a tired man who sometimes forgot birthdays, who laughed too loudly at old movies, who couldn't sleep after long tours, who was afraid of disappointing people. His smile broke, and somehow you stayed. Priscilla could no longer hold back her tears. They streamed silently down her face. Elvis reached up, carefully brushed them away with his thumb.
I've stood in front of hundreds of thousands of people. I've heard entire stadiums scream my name. I've accepted awards. I've shaken hands with presidents. I've watched strangers cry because of my songs. He looked toward the rain-covered windows. But every single night, all I ever wanted was to come home. His eyes returned to hers, because applause always ends. The lights always go dark. The curtain always falls. The crowds always leave. He touched her cheek. But every time I opened that front door, you were here. You never asked me to be perfect. You never asked me to be a legend. You only asked me to come home safely. His voice cracked. And that is the greatest love I have ever known. Priscilla stepped forward without saying another word. She wrapped both arms around him. He embraced her just as tightly. Neither of them cared how long they stood there. Outside, the rain finally stopped. A narrow beam of evening sunlight broke through the clouds. It entered through the large windows of Graceland. The golden light settled across the old photograph still lying on the table. Young Elvis smiled forever beside a group of strangers, people who had loved him from afar, people whose lives had been touched by his music. Elvis slowly released the embrace. He walked to the photograph, picked it up once more. He looked at the sentence written on the back. We could never make you ours, but our hearts never learned how to let you go. For a long moment, he simply smiled. Then he picked up a fountain pen from the desk nearby. Priscilla watched curiously. What are you doing? Elvis turned the photograph over. Beneath the faded sentence, he carefully wrote another. His handwriting was calm, steady, honest. When he finished, he handed the photograph to Priscilla. She read the new words. Thank you for loving the man the world believed they knew. But the greatest gift God ever gave me was the woman who loved the man they never saw. Priscilla covered her mouth. Fresh tears blurred the ink. She looked at Elvis. He smiled. Not the famous smile that appeared on magazine covers. Not the smile that made concert arenas erupt. A smaller smile. A quieter one. The smile that belonged only to home. Years later, people would continue to remember Elvis Presley for his music, for the sold-out concerts, for the records that changed history, for the dazzling white jumpsuits, for the roaring applause. But inside Graceland, there remained another memory, one that no audience ever witnessed. One rainy afternoon, a white envelope filled with strangers' love letters almost convinced one woman that she was standing in the shadow of the entire world. Instead, it reminded her of something far greater. Fame can make millions admire a person. Talent can inspire generations. Success can fill stadiums, but none of those things can replace the quiet love waiting behind a front door. Because legends belong to history,
Songs belong to the world. Applause belongs to the moment. But home? Home belongs to the heart. And perhaps that is why, long after the music fades, long after the lights go out, long after the final curtain falls, the greatest love story is never written by the crowd. It is written by the one person who stays when everyone else has already gone home.